Welcome everyone to the Chemical Speciation Network training webinar. I think we'll go ahead and get started here, and I'll hand it over to Melinda.
All right, great, and welcome again everyone. I am Melinda Beaver. I'm in EPA's Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards in the Ambient Air Monitoring Group. And I'll first start with just a few logistics about today's webinar. First, just as a reminder for us all, I want to point out that we are recording today's webinar. So you can see that recording icon in the top of your screen. So we plan to post this later for future access, but just wanted to point that out to everyone that it is being recorded. Next, we have everyone, like all the participants in the webinar, muted to try to keep sound quality, to maintain the sound quality. So please remain on mute throughout the webinar until we get to the question and answer session at the end. And then at that point, you can either ask questions by audio, by unmuting yourself, or you can also ask questions via the chat box in the Zoom interface. So as Jennifer said, this is a webinar on data validation and DART for the data collected by the Chemical Speciation Network. And so I'll just briefly note that since the rollout of DART in the Chemical Speciation Network, that we've consistently seen that a majority of the data sets, so around 80% or so of the monthly data sets, are reviewed by you all, the folks that are on this webinar. And I think that's a really great number, and we're happy to see so many state and local air agencies validating these data sets. So thank you for that work that you do, and please continue it in the future. So today we have Nikki Young from the University of California at Davis and Jennifer DeWinter from Sonoma Tech, who each work on various aspects of data processing and review in the Chemical Speciation Network. And they will be leading us through the webinar, each focusing on kind of their areas of expertise within the process. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Nikki to get started with the content of today's webinar.
Great, thank you, Melinda. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We do this webinar hopefully every year with updates and new features and reminders. And so we'll just start with a couple of, I guess, housekeeping points in relating to the current situation of the world rather than necessarily the data. So hopefully the slide will change for me. Sorry, technical difficulties as always. Here we go. So with everything that's going on in the world, firstly, hope you're all well and safe. But this is actually going to end up impacting some of the data that you see in DART. So as you know, batches typically arrive in DART for the 30-day review window, and they typically arrive about 120 days after the end of the sampling period. Unfortunately, with analytical labs being closed due to the COVID-19 pandemic, some data deliveries will be affected in terms of their delivery to DART. The analytical lab was closed for approximately 6 weeks, beginning in March, and is starting to operate at reduced capacity. So the first data set that you might see be delayed, being delivered to DART, will be the January 2020 filters. So here's a little table covering the filter times that were sampled in the field, and when for previous data sets, the time periods that they were available to be validated in DART and when they were available for the public once they were delivered to AQS. And for January, we anticipate being able to process the data and have it available for you for review in DART later this month. So it's a little later than would have been otherwise anticipated. But you'll still get the full 30-day review window, and we hope to be able to turn it around and deliver it to AQS early August. So these dates are very tentative at the moment. It's kind of a work in progress, depending on how the analytical labs are doing. But be sure that the data will get to you at some point. And if you have any questions about timeframes, please feel free to get in touch. But hopefully you'll get the normal notifications when your data are ready to be reviewed. So getting back to normal kind of aspects of the webinar, I'm going to pass over to Jennifer with some DART status and plans.
Thanks, Nikki. Hi, everyone. This is Jennifer DeWinter with Sonoma Tech, and thank you, Melinda, for the introduction. So I guess maybe one of the few things thus far not impacted by COVID is the neat things that we have occurring and planned for DART this year. So 2020 had several new and enhanced features planned, and we'll cover those on our webinar today and provide an overview of the new functionality, how it works, and when it will become available for you all in DART. I've listed several of those new items here at the top of the list. So we've built in to DART a new administration page for all of you to be able to configure the CSN validators that are registered for your agency. And so that's an exciting addition, which we think will make it a lot easier for you all to, have control over your staff and what capabilities they have in DART for CSN review. And then secondly, we have new options related to editing multiple parameters at one time within DART. We had several pre-existing options and we've added some more, so we'll definitely cover that in detail on the webinar. We have some other changes to editing functions, particularly as they relate to several of the qualifiers. And then sort of ongoing, standard operations and maintenance include, addressing any bugs or other issues that may come up. And it's especially helpful when you all get in touch with us to point those out so we can address them. Responding to any questions, providing some user's guide updates and providing new training material such as this webinar, and continuing to log any other changes or needs that you may have so that we can get them on the list for future development cycles for DART. So, and to that end, the best way to get in touch with us all is the CSN support email address, which is shown there on the bottom of the slide. So please do reach out with questions, ideas, feedback. It's very valuable to us, and we very much appreciate when you, get in touch with our team. I think, Nikki, it's back over to you.
Thanks, Jennifer. So just so that you know, if you have to leave this webinar at any point or want to come back, to just looking at what resources are available in general to help you both with data validation specific to CSN and otherwise, and how to use DART, then here's a list of various resources that are available to you. So we have the data validation guides and the DART users guide, but we also have access to previous webinars. So the ones I've listed here are actually from last year's webinar, but previous webinars are still available as well. And then just as a reminder, today's webinar will be recorded, so you can come back and look at both the video and the slides at a later date. I also wanted to point out that we do some data validation training at the National Ambient Air Monitoring Conference, which happens every 2 years. So here's some links to the slides from that presentation training from 2 years ago. And then some other documentation, just in case it's of use or interest for you, but hosted at the Air Quality Research Center website here at UC Davis. We have the annual site reports available, which is a fairly new piece of documentation, and it kind of gives you an overview of the data at that site on an annual basis. So go check those out if you're interested. And then some more of the kind of longer reports, annual reports, QA reports, data advisories, which are always handy, and SOPs if you're interested in the procedures we perform here at UC Davis. So to today's webinar, this is just an overview of what we'll hopefully be covering. I know a lot of you are new to the program, new to validation, and we got some of our regulars as well. So we'll briefly cover, just give an overview of the Chemical Speciation Network in general. So what's the data pathway, network details, so you can kind of put your site's data into context. What parameters do we report at different parts of the process, null codes and qualifier codes to pass on useful information to end users of the data, and dates is a big part of the Chemical Speciation Network data. We'll then go over, I'll pass over to Jennifer to give an overview of Dart functionality, the data flow, how to access and manage your data, and then the tools that are available to help you validate the data. We'll then go over some more of the details of the data and try and give you some indications of best practices for validating the data and what things you might want to look out for in the data, questions that I have about possible suspect results, or just in general how to go about approaching validating your data and using the tools available to you in Dart. We'll then kind of sum up with some final notes and tips, and then hopefully have a decent amount of time to go through any questions that you have. But as Melinda said earlier, please leave your comments or questions in the Zoom chat box, and we'll review them at the end, or speak up at the time later on. So with that, let's get started. Okay, so here's an overview of the CSN. So here's a map that was kind of current just under a month ago, and we have about 142 sites in the network at the moment. And the network was established by the EPA in about 2000 as part of the PM 2.5 NAAQS review. And the purpose of the network is routine monitoring of speciated PM 2.5 in urban areas across the US. And the hope is that with this long-term monitoring of PM 2.5 chemical composition, we'll better understand air quality and the human health concerns from particulate matter. So we've got about 142 sites, and in each of those sites, we have two samplers, two instruments. There's the MET1 SAS or Super SAS, and the URG. So those are pictured there for those that don't go into the field. This is kind of what you're seeing if you were in the field. And even though we've got two samplers, we actually run 3 different filter types. There's the PTFE or Teflon filter, there's nylon and quartz. And the PTFE and nylon run in the SAS sampler, and the quartz is run in the URG. And there's some photographs there of the typical looks of the 3 different filter types. So we start on the left-hand side with the PTFE, the middle is nylon, and then quartz on the right-hand side. So for each of those 3 filter types, they run for 24 hours for samples, every 3 or 6 days, depending on the sampling frequency at each of the sites. We also have field blanks running once a month at each site, and it's of each of the filter types. So 3 field blanks in total at each site, but it's 1 filter type. So once the samples are collected, what's the pathway look like? Well, we begin with the operator actually running the filters in the field. They then send those physical filters as well as the field documentation through to Wood, who are our filter shipping and handling laboratory. Wood enters all that data from the operations in the field and ships out that information electronically to UC Davis and sends the physical filters to the relevant labs for analysis. Those labs are RTI, who do the IC analysis on the nylon filter, and then here at UC Davis, we have XRF analysis on the Teflon filter and carbon analysis for the quartz filter. Once all the samples have been analyzed, the data is sent to us here at UC Davis, and we process the data put the data into concentrations, do some level of validation, QA/QC, before submitting the data to DART at STI. That opens up the data validation window for the state, local, and tribal validators like yourselves, and you have the 30-day window to review the data. So just to point out here that you own the data, and so your review and validation is really important to ensure that what ends up being available to end users in AQS is as correct as possible. So once your validation window closes, the data is returned to UC Davis. We review your changes, make any changes that you've not been able to do in DART, just confirm that the changes that you've made are actually being reflected in the final data set. We then reformat the data into the appropriate format for AQS and submit it there. And so this is just a little screenshot on the side of what those files look like. So they're pipe delimited, so they're not the nicest data to look at in that form. So that's the data pathway. And so let's get into a bit more about the measurements themselves. So as said, we've got the 3 filter types, and with the Teflon filter, sorry, PTFE filter, I should say, we perform X-ray fluorescence analysis to obtain information on the elements, including soil and metallic elements. And there's 33 of them. For the nylon filters at RTI, they perform ion chromatography analysis to obtain information on ions, including ammonium, sodium, potassium, nitrate, sulfate, chloride. And then finally, the quartz filters are analyzed through thermal optical analysis here at UC Davis to obtain results on organic carbon, OC, elemental carbon, also known as EC, and their respective fractions. So just to show you the full list of parameters, this is more kind of a reference slide if you want to come back and have a look later on, but those are the 33 elements, the 6 ions, and then the carbon results. So there's a slight nuance with the carbon results in that only some of them are there for you in DART to validate, and it's because OC and EC results should reflect how the other fractions are doing, but all the fractions will go to AQS as well. Further, this information is available for samples, but also field blanks. But field blanks will only have their raw data reported to AQS, whereas in DART, we use a nominal sample volume to be able to have a concentration that's more comparable to the values that you're looking at for samples. And I'll go into why that's important later on when you're trying to review field blank and sample data. So those are the species that we have, but we also report operational data. So these are the values that are collected in the field when the samples are running. So there's some specifics. Not all operational values are treated the same through the process. We have some that are reported only to DART and some that are reported to both DART and AQS. So the ones that are reported to DART are typically ones that are to aid your validation of the data. I'll just go through this table quickly in that we'll start at the top with those that are reported to both DART and AQS. So we have operational values such as your average ambient pressure and temperature. And just to note that this is actually a value that should be reported by your samplers rather than it being a calculated value based on the min and max values from the samplers. Further, they are actually one measurement for each of the 2 samplers. So in the case of the SAS, we have 2 filters running, but we report the ambient pressure and temperature as if it was associated with the Teflon. We also have flow rate CV and sample volume, and these are all reported per filter type other than the ambient pressure and temperature that I just explained. We also have per sampling event calculated variable soil and reconstructed mass. I'll come back to that in a second. We also have measured PM2.5 gravimetric mass. And this is a direct measurement in the field, but it's only currently a couple of CSN sites that actually perform that measurement as part of the CSN. For those parameters that age or validation, the DART only calculated variables, ammonium nitrate, ammonium sulfate, and organic mass by carbon. And these are typically values multiplied to kind of estimate what ammonium nitrate would be based on just the nitrate ion measurement, for example. And again, these are reported per sampling event. We have the AirNow Tech mass data, which is also measured in the field. And here at UC Davis, we download that data from a repository and we provide this to DART, again, to aid your validation. But just note that you should all have your own AirNow accounts. So if you want to go and download more up-to-date data or data on a different frequency, rather than the 24 hours, if you want to do your own calculations, then please know that you can go and do that. You don't have to use what is provided. And that's, again, it's per sampling event and where it's available. And then finally, another operational value is transport temperature. So transport temperature is the temperature that is received back at Wood from the filters being shipped back from the site. And this value is provided to you in DART to confirm the application of a relevant qualifier relating to this. And it should be reported per filter type. So I just wanted to come back to soil and reconstructed mass. Last year, these were actually included in the DART only section, but this is a new thing recently where we are actually now starting to report it with AQS. And we will go into the details of those later on in terms of how they're calculated and some of the logical criteria we have for handling those across the network. So moving on to CSN codes, I'm sure many of you realize that there are two main categories of codes. So we have qualifier codes, which can be termed validity flags or informational flags, and they are applied when a filter is, or a record is valid, and they can provide information to end users on local conditions, sampling abnormalities, and instrument discrepancies. Null codes invalidate and terminate the sample or that record, and these can be applied because of instrument malfunctions, human errors, power failures, anything that would mean that the results are either no good or we don't have any results for various reasons. So each of these have some nuances in terms of the application type. So there can be different levels of applications. So we can have parameter-specific applications. For example, if a concentration is below an MDL, which is the method detection limit, then the MD qualifier will be applied only to the sulfate value in that case. We also have application to groups of analytical species. For example, you might want to flag all the elemental species, so your soil and metallic elements, because something occurred at the analysis level. So the Teflon filter, for example, was dropped in the lab, so it's potential contamination to all of the species. You may want to only flag the operational data, and again, this may be parameter specific even within that grouping of operational data. One example is that the flow rate CV is not recorded, but all of the data, all of the operational data and results are valid. So therefore, we have to apply a null code to the flow rate CV only because it's missing, and AQS will not allow us to deliver a record that has no value without it being invalidated. We can then have the application at the filter level, and this would typically include all the species and the operational parameters for that filter. So, for example, a filter did not run, so there's no operational values, there's no sample volume, there's no runtime, and then the analytical species can therefore not be calculated, or we don't have any actual results. So all parameters relating to that one filter will be invalidated. And if the issue is such that, say, a sampler didn't run, sorry, a site was down, for example, then you may consider invalidating all filter types. So all 3 of the Teflon, nylon, and quartz filters for a given sampling day. So the example here is the power failure on site. So the sampling time was actually out of range, too little sample, so invalidate all the data from that day. Just kind of put this all on one slide as a kind of a reminder that application of some flags may depend on certain criteria or value ranges as well. And because of that, the application may be automatic during the processing at UC Davis. So please review all the flags to confirm the application is correct, and then address any data as needed. So dates is another complicated one, but in Dart, only one date time gets delivered, but there are actually several dates associated with a given filter. So there's the expected use date, and this is the date based on the site sampling frequency, so potentially every 3rd or 6th day of the month. And then there's the intended use date. So this is when the physical filter actually gets created, when we know that everything should be going to plan, filter is created, and then we have an intended use date associated with it. The filter then goes out to the field, and then we have the actual sampling run date and time, and then obviously 24 hours later, hopefully, we have the end date and time. But as mentioned, there's only one day or time that actually gets delivered to Dart and AQS. And typically this is the actual sampling run date or time, but sometimes it can be one of the other dates. So if a filter does not run, it won't have a run date in our records. So in order to be able to report a single run date, we will use the intended use date for that filter, and it will be invalidated. And so things start to get a little tricky with handling these dates. So I guess we want to ask that make the information available to us as clear as possible, because if multiple sets of filters are used on different dates to their intended date, this can cause problems with apparent duplicate samples. So, if filters are being used to catch up, then it's likely that at some point down the road, there will be a filter that's invalidated because it can't be used. And then we have to make sure that all the dates, there's only one date for each filter type in the end. So just some examples on why dates are important, or how you might see some indication that the dates are kind of a little different or not in line with the intended use date. So filters may not run for 24 hours. So if it's within 23 to 25 hours, the data may end up, you may see it flagged with the Y qualifier, which is the elapsed time out of spec. If it's more than an hour either side of the target 24 hours, the data will actually be invalidated with the AG, sample timeout limits, null code. That's more on the time side. In terms of the dates, specific dates, data may not run on the intended date. And to indicate this to you in Dart and to end users, there will be a 2, which is the operational deviation qualifier applied, but this is only specific to samples and not field blanks. The data may also end up being reported as invalid due to how filters are processed if a filter runs in a different month. A run date time may be entered if empty to avoid apparent duplicate issues with other filters that run different days that happen to be sampling days. There could also be the possibility that a filter is never generated. So it has the expected use date, but then it doesn't get created, so there's no intended use date. In which case, for example, a sampler is down for repairs, so the filter shipment from Wood to the site is paused. And so here at UC Davis, we try and, for completeness purposes, can fill in these empty records based on the expected view states. And we'll go into that more detail of how that looks in Dart later on in this webinar. So I think with those kind of nitty-gritty details, I will pass on to Jennifer, who will give you some more information about Dart.
Thanks, Nikki. Yeah, so as she mentioned, we'll kind of dive in now to what all you can do within Dart to review the data when it is submitted from the lab into Dart. So here's just the overall data flow to and from Dart, and I imagine this is something many of you are already familiar with, but for the new validators, we just wanted to sort of review the process. And so within Dart, we think of things as these review windows, 30-day review windows that begin when UC Davis submits the latest batch of CSN data to Dart. And when that happens, when the data are received by Dart, all of the state, local, and tribal data validators who are registered with Dart as validators, and we'll come back to how to do that in a future slide here, but all of those validators are sent an email electronically and automatically that the 30-day review window has started and that there are new CSN data waiting for review. And from then on, you have a month of time to log into Dart and review the data and any flags that have been applied or suggested by the laboratory in Dart, and to do a number of QC checks, which will cover some recommended practices on what to look for and at. And then, during and after your review, you can then approve the data, apply any additional or different null or qualifier codes as needed, and leave comments either for your own agency or, comments that you'd like the laboratory to see related to your changes. And then at the end of the 30-day window, the data are automatically sent back to UC Davis, who review all of the changes, make any final changes as needed based on required flagging rules, so to speak, and then they ultimately will upload the data to AQS. And so in addition to that first automated email, when the data first become available in Dart, all of the validators will receive an email when we're sort of halfway through the review window and there are 2 weeks remaining, and then also when it's 1 day from the end of the review window as a reminder. And overall, I guess, the main point here is that this 30-day window is definitely the time period in which we ask that you all come into Dart, review your data, identify any questions or uncertainties you may have, and certainly reach out to our team if needed, using the CSN support email address, so that any uncertainties that need to be clarified, if possible, we can take care of that during the review period so that any final flagging or comments can be applied within Dart, and so that the data are as final as possible when they get sent back to the laboratory. And so Dart, as I mentioned here, is the data analysis and reporting tool, and it's available to you all within AirNow Tech. And you do have to have a registered AirNow Tech account to access Dart. So this is just a reminder for how you go about that. There's a request an account link from the login page. So if you don't have one, you just come and fill out this form and send a request over to have your account approved. One important point is just to make sure that you are requesting that account with the agency for which you would be viewing or validating CSN data, as that agency is what we use to determine which CSN data you have access to within Dart. And then once you've logged in, you will either see Dart alone in the navigation menu for Aeronautech, or you may have an Aeronautech account that gives you access to other tools as well, in which case you would find Dart under the Tools menu. And when you click on Dart, it brings you to the landing page here. And I'm going to direct our attention to the Manage navigation within Dart, which is really where you have access, sort of your entry point to all of the CSN data within Dart. And so when you navigate to Manage, you'll see two different tables of data sets that are available in Dart. The top table is the one we're going to focus on, and this is the table that contains all of the CSN data sets for your air quality agency. Below that, if you are using Dart for other data sets, not CSN, you might have data shown in that lower table, and those are personal to you and your account. But the top data set is shared by all of the CSN validators within your agency. And there are a number of columns in this table. The first column is the date of the latest data that were received, where it came from, so in this case, the laboratory for CSN. Here you would see the data set name, which would be populated with the AQS site code for that CSN site. The date range of data available within Dart, a download option, and you can download data files in several different formats for either just the latest batch of data or the entire data record that's within Dart. And then finally, the approval status column. And this is one of the most important columns in that it indicates to you whether you have a batch of CSN data that are awaiting approval, already approved, and the review window is still open, or the batch is locked and the review window has closed and the data have been sent back to the laboratory. And clicking this icon, regardless of which one it is, will take you into the CSN approval mode page in Dart, which I'll come back to here momentarily. But first I want to highlight one of the new functions that we have in Dart as of this year. There's a new Manage Users link here at the top of this CSN datasets table. And this is how your agency will now be able to configure the validators for CSN data in your agency in Dart. So when you click that Manage Users link, it will direct you to a page that looks something like this one. This is a page that is displaying Aeronautech users for, in this case, my agency, Sonoma Technology. And we don't validate any CSN data, so this is just a bit of a mock-up of what this page would look like for your agencies. But what you'll see here is a table that has a row for each registered Aeronautech user for your agency. And then 3 columns here that can be used to configure different settings for each of those users. The first column, called CSN Admin, is designed to let you choose within your agency who should be the administrator that can come to this page, who is responsible for configuring validators and ensuring that validators are receiving automated Dart emails. And so the CSN admin is an important column from a management perspective of who might be responsible for the list of approved validators. And then the second column is actually indicating which users are the CSN validator. So in this case, I'm checked as being a CSN validator, which means that when I log into Dart, I would be able to navigate to approval mode and review CSN data. And I would see that CSN datasets table on my manage page. So if you have new validators who are coming on board within your agency, this would be a screen to come to and configure them to be validators within Dart. And then the final column is, again, to configure whether any of these users should be receiving automated CSN emails. Oftentimes, both columns would be checked, so all of the validators are receiving the automated email so that they know when new data are available and how much time they have left within the review window. But that may not always be true. You may have folks within your agency that just want to see the emails so that they understand, what data are available and where the CSN process is at. but they may or may not actually be responsible for coming into Dart to perform validation. So a couple of key requests of you all with this new page. We've made this page available in Dart, so this is already live for everyone. And we've configured for now all of the CSN validators to be admins. And so it would be great if you can, for your agency, confirm who the appropriate admins should be, and then log into Dart, navigate to this new page, and update that table to properly reflect your admins. So that's first step related to this new page. And then moving forward, if you do have any changes related to your list of CSN validators for your agency, please do take advantage of this new functionality and log into Dart to configure those validators. And that might be adding validators, removing validators, but this would be the three-step process for doing that. So really it's just log in, navigate to that new Manage Users webpage from the Dart Manage screen, and then find the row for the user and either check or uncheck the box or boxes as needed for each of those functions. And definitely let us know, as once we have a new batch of CSN data available and you're perhaps going into Dart, if you have any questions on this process or what the different columns mean, please do reach out to us about that. Okay, so I wanted to return to the Dart approval mode page, which is really where the bulk of the CSN data review occurs. And just as a reminder, you can get to this page from those icons on the Manage web page. And when you come into approval mode is a page that's configured specifically for a CSN site to review the current batch of CSN data. And there's a lot of different functionality available on this page. I'm just going to walk through sort of an overview of all of it, and then we'll dive into a few topics in more detail, especially some of the new functions. So I want to draw your attention here to this portion of the top of the page first. So this indicates which site you're looking at, and it's sort of blanked out here, but when you log into approval mode, you'll see your AQS site code here for the data set that you're looking at. And then you see the batch that you're looking at, and you see two things: the date that this batch was created, so when the data became available in Dart, and then you also see the review by date, so when the 30-day review window will end. And in some circumstances, you may have a reason to navigate to prior or more recent data batches. And we may be entering a period where that is necessary if we end up needing to make up a little time on the CSN data review because of COVID. And so you may end up having more than one active batch in Dart. And so you can get to any of those batches using these toggles, or actually opening a calendar picker to select the batch. So I wanted to highlight that functionality. And then down below that, we have what we call the batch summary table. And this provides an overview of all of the flagging that may have been applied upstream of Dart to all of the samples within this batch. And so you see in this table a row for each date, and then some summaries of the qualifiers applied and the null codes applied, as well as an overall completeness indication. And the summary table is a really good way to sort of take stock of what all you may need to look at in more depth within this batch. Some of the qualifiers you'll see often and you'll know what they mean, and other ones may be new or unique to this batch, and so would require a bit more investigation. And yet still you may actually have some specific qualifiers such as C1 that Nikki mentioned, and we'll talk about C1 a little bit more later, but you see it here at the start of this list. And that's an indicator that the lab has called out something specifically that they are requesting your input on. So I'll show you a screenshot later on of what this summary table looks like when that flag has been applied. And then when you scroll down the approval mode page, then you come to what we call the batch data table. And this is the detailed view of all the data in the batch. And it's also the point that where you can access the editing functions. So here you have a row for each date and each parameter occurrence code that were in this batch. And then you see the concentration value, the percentile of that concentration, the method detection limit and uncertainty values, units, and then 3 buttons that are clickable for editing data and leaving comments. And I'll also highlight just the filter box here, which can be used to filter down this data table for particular parameters of interest, dates of interest, codes of interest, and you can filter on what you can see and also what you can't see. So you could filter on, for example, parameter name, but also parameter AQS code if you're most familiar with that. You can filter on that as well. You can also filter on the dates using the summary table. So if you click on a row in this summary table, it will automatically filter the batch data table for that date. But I want to now move into the editing batch function. So if you click on either of these 2 icons, you'll move into what we call the edit batch window, which really enables all of the editing functionality for you. And when you click on that row and click on the button in a row, what is going to happen by default is that you would be editing that parameter for that date. And you then have choices about which null and or qualifier codes you'd like applied or removed. And you're asked to leave a comment, and then you can click save. And so that's sort of the default behavior. But there's actually quite a bit more available to you within the edit batch window in terms of which dates you'd like to edit, groups of parameters, and then some previewing functionality. And so these are the steps as you move through that window. At the top, you can view the latest comment, and that may be when you first come in, the comment that was left either by UC Davis or Wood, as they were performing their steps in the CSN data processing. And then, or that might be the latest comment left by you or another validator in your agency. And then the second step here is to select the date or dates that you'd like to edit. And again, the date that shows up here by default is for the row that you selected in that table, but you do have some advanced options for choosing other dates or multiples. And then the third step is to select the parameters that you would like to edit. And I'm going to come back to that because we have a lot of new functionality to talk about here. Finally, you can choose the null or qualifier codes that you'd like applied or removed to those parameters. And then you see a little preview down here of what the original codes look like, and then how the parameters will look with flags after you perform the changes if you're making them. And then the comment box is where you can please leave a comment for our team and also for your agency to indicate what change you're making and why, and if there are any subsequent changes needed. Okay, so I wanted to highlight specifically here the new apply to options for which parameters will be edited. This dropdown already existed in that it had 4 different options for which groups of parameters you could edit at one time. But we've made some changes to that dropdown, and then we've also added some new options below it. So one thing we've changed is that we've updated the names of what the groups are that are available in this dropdown to call out more specifically which parameters are being edited, whether you're editing a sample, so an individual filter, an entire sampling event, and also analytical versus operational parameters. The other new addition here are that we have the ability for you to edit either the ambient parameters, the field blanks, or both. And then we have the option for any of these groups of parameters to also include the operational parameters in the editing at the same time. And I'll come back to those. But And then finally, a new drop-down for which parameter occurrence code you would like to edit. Previously, edits were performed to all of them, and for those of you that do have co-located instruments, you now can specify the POC that you'd like to edit. So just sort of a summary here of how to select parameters. And this is especially relevant if you're editing multiple parameters at one time, not the single parameter for the row that you selected, but if you've changed that apply to dropdown to edit multiple parameters at a time. And these are the options in that apply to menu. So you have only that selected species, but you can also choose to edit all of the parameters for the selected sample event. And so this would include by default all 3 filter types and the analytical species. And then for each filter here, you have the option to edit the analytical species for that filter individually. And then finally, we have a new group which enables you to just edit the operational parameters for the selected filter. But I wanted to come back to these two because while these only include the analytical species for either the individual filter or all 3 filters, we have a new checkbox which lets you also include the operational parameters as well. And so that would enable, the example that Nikki mentioned where if a filter, for example, did not run and a null code was applied, it would be applied to both the analytical and the operational parameters, and you may need to come in and apply a more specific null code if you know something more specifically about why it didn't run. That's maybe a common example. And so that this new set of options would enable you to edit both the analytical and operational parameters at one time. And so this slide is just kind of recapping that you have this new checkbox to also edit those operational parameters, and this just summarizes what they are. And then those other 2 new options I mentioned about choosing ambient versus blanks and the parameter occurrence code to edit. And then finally, I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but basically, there's a few new groups, and it's a bit tricky to identify which parameters will be edited. And so this slide summarizes that with more words than I want to cover here, but this will be available in the slide deck for you all to look at, as a reference. Finally, this is just, again, reminding you about the advanced options for editing multiple sample dates and the preview box. And overall here, just the sort of, editing rules and to keep in mind as you're performing edits. And a couple of important ones are that you can have either a null code or qualifier codes, but not both. And so to edit a null code, for example, you may have to first remove the qualifier codes and vice versa. The second bullet there is related to missing values. And so we do require that any parameters that do not have a concentration value and display as -999, they have to have a null code. So you may not be able to remove a null code for those cases. And then as I mentioned, if you have a more specific null code then maybe was applied upstream of Dart, please do apply it within Dart. And then finally, related to the reconstructed mass and soil parameters in particular, the AI or insufficient data null code is applied in certain cases, and Nikki will cover that in a future slide. Editing values is another option from the batch data table. And so I'll just quickly highlight that there's a button here for you to edit values for the operational parameters specifically, since, for example, you may have a misrecorded value and you can clarify what the appropriate value should be within Dart. There are a number of graphs available to you as well within approval mode. The time series graph, the scatter plot, the stack bar chart, the fingerprint plot, and a map. And the main thing that I'll highlight about these graphs is that they all are populated by default with data from this current batch, and either all parameters or a subset of parameters, but the plus icon lets you add or remove parameters, so you can customize those as you need to do for your review. And with that, that's a quick overview of Dart functionality as well as new things, and I'll hand it back to Nikki to cover data best practices.
Thanks, Jennifer. So yeah, we're now going to switch gears a little bit and start to discuss some specifics and detailed examples of CSN data. To start with, we're probably going to start with the discussion details of specific null code and qualifier code applications. I gave a general overview on this earlier, but I'm now going to present further information. And again, there's going to be lots of text, for which I apologize, but this is more for your reference later on when you want to review these slides to aid your validation. So starting with specific flags and the applications of null codes. There we go. But here's a list of various null codes. Not all the null codes are available to you, but those that have different applications, and I'll describe why they have specific applications. And just to note that these criteria are written into our processing codes, so they're automated in the application, or sometimes the opposite, they're removed if added to more parameters than required. So just to go through a couple of them, we have AI, which is insufficient data, and these, they can be applied to more, but we say that for reconstruction mass and soil, they should be applied instead of other null codes. And that's because if there's any of the contributing species to reconstruction mass or soil, if they're invalid, these calculated parameters should ultimately be invalid as well. Next, we have these three null codes that typically are applied to specific operational parameters such as flow rate CV and sample volume, as well as all the associated species. And the reasoning behind this is that these issues typically affect specific operational values and therefore likely impact all the associated species concentrations. Just to note here, the SV, the sample volume out of limits null code, is actually more of a last resort null code. So typically if you see this null code, it means that all of the other operational data looks okay, at the flow rate CV, for example, and there's no other indication that we have reason to suspect bad sampling. However, the sampling volume impacts concentrations, so if only the sample volume value is bad, for example, a transcription error, recording, typo, it could indicate that kind of issue rather than a true sampling issue. So those should be addressed when you see the SV null code. Next, we have a group of null codes that typically are only applied to the species. And this is because the species concentrations are likely affected by these reasons, and because the issues occur after sampling, so it's unlikely that the operational parameters are affected. For example, filter damage may occur during transit back to the sample handling lab, therefore the operational values in the field are likely to be okay, so could be marked valid, but the analysis results may be impacted. And finally, we have this null code. We rarely see it used in the data. It's specific only to ions analysis. And so it's typically used by the analysis lab themselves, but in general, it should only be applied to ions data. So that's kind of the specifics of the null codes, and now we're moving on to qualifiers. Again, this is not the full list of qualifiers that are available for use, but these are the ones with some of the specific applications. So to begin with, we have QT and QP, and these are more recent, a couple of years ago, recently introduced, and these are temperature and pressure sensors questionable. And in the case of QT, where it's a temperature sensor is questionable, that flag will only get applied to ambient temperature parameter. We then have W, which is flow rate average out spec, and this would likely impact all of the species for that filter, as well as some operational. And the thought behind this is that flow is unlikely to affect things like ambient temperature, pressure, or the transport temperature in particular. So it's unnecessary to have that flag applied to those parameters when it's not likely to be affected. And I just grouped these last ones together because they are either applicable to the full set of categories of species, or in the case of MX, it's just carbon species. And again, there's likely to be no influence of these issues on the operations in the field. Just to note, the category third from the bottom, the various informational, there's many of them, and they can relate to fireworks, you know, kind of local events, and so they all begin with I, but they're a 2-character code. Also, one that's not listed here, but there are several qualifiers that AQS will not allow to be paired to the average ambient temperature parameter. And so this combination of qualifiers and ambient temperature parameter is rarely seen in the data, but we will have to strip that qualifier from that parameter if we do see that combination. Otherwise, the whole record will not get into AQS. And if it's a valid data, then obviously we'd want that to get in there into AQS. Just the flag will have to be removed. So this slide, I apologize for all the text and colors, and we actually kind of covered it last year. So I'm just going to try and leave it here for, again, future or later reference. But I'm going to bring up a couple of examples so that you know how to interpret the use of this table. So in general, there are various value ranges that we deem to be valid. And outside of these ranges, either a qualifier or null code may be applied to indicate a sampling anomaly to the end user. So these ranges actually vary depending on the sampler in the field, as well as what is deemed acceptable or not acceptable in CSN in general, as well as the AQS criteria. So I'm going to use the flow rate CV example here. So for the acceptable range deemed in CSN, we have 2 different ranges based on the sampler. So the acceptable range for the URG, so the carbon data, is 0 to 2%, whereas for the SAS, actually the range is wider, and it's 0 to 5%. Outside of these values, the AH null code will be applied, and that's the flow rate or flow rate CV out of range. When you come to AQS delivery, if the values are outside of these ranges, which are 0 to 20%, liters per minute, this is in terms of sample flow, then, no, sorry, that should be percent, my bad. 0 to 20%, then the AN null code will actually be applied. So if AH is already in place, we will apply AN ultimately for AQS delivery. Let's just move on to the next one. There we go. So this is the new part of recent deliveries, and reconstructed mass and soil have been available for use in DART for a while, but are now delivered to AQS. So we thought we'd take this opportunity to give some more information about what these 2 calculated variables are. So reconstructed mass is meant to give a representation of the PM2.5 mass, and it's based on the actual composition rather than a direct PM2.5 measurement, but will hopefully be compared if any direct PM2.5 measurements are available. So reconstructed mass is based on the sum of ammonium sulfate, ammonium nitrate, soil, chloride, elemental carbon, and organic mass by carbon. And each of these are calculated variables themselves. So you can see that ammonium sulfate is actually using the sulfur measurement from the Teflon filter, and nitrate is using nitrate, some calculation of nitrate. And then soil, I've also listed the equation here, but it's based on the relationships of crustal soil oxides. So we've got aluminum, silicon, calcium, iron, and titanium. So those are there for you if you want to know the details about each of those 2 variables. And then at the bottom, I've listed some of these kind of logics that have been implemented to ensure consistency with how these data are handled across the network, and therefore how they may be used by end users. So if any of these parent species, for example, sulfur, if they're invalid, then the reconstructed variable will actually receive the AI null code, which is insufficient data to calculate. If any of the qualifiers from parent species present, they will also be propagated and applied to reconstructed mass and soil. However, in the case of the MD qualifier, which is a value below detection, then it will be stripped from reconstructed mass only before delivery. And I think this is back to Jennifer.
Thanks, Nikki. Yeah, so just to recap about those new changes regarding the reconstructed mass and soil being submitted to AQS, we just wanted to touch on how those composite or calculated variables are handled in Dart. And currently, Dart allows you to edit both the calculated variables and any of the what we call the underlying contributing variables, such as what Nikki showed in the prior slide about you know, how those which parameters are used in those calculations. And Dart lets you edit any and all of those, sort of independent of how they relate. So, you know, if you were to edit any of the parameters of soil, Dart doesn't then require you make any edits to the soil variable itself. And we're not planning to change that. We just wanted to highlight the fact that if you do edit, for example, the reconstructed mass or soil or contributing variable, and it your change isn't consistent with that logic that Nikki just described, we just wanted to note that the data may end up being different when it's submitted by UC Davis to AQS in order to maintain consistency with those logical requirements. And so the only change we're planning to make is to implement just a warning message in Dart about that, you know, and just, you know, presenting a warning for your consideration that editing either the calculated or contributing variables, you know, warrants a bit of thought about how those relate to each other. But we're still going to permit all edits, you know, as needed. But we're definitely open to any feedback on how that functionality, you know, could function in Dart in the future. And I think next we're going to highlight some specific CSN flags. But in the interest of time, Nikki, I'm wondering if maybe we jump ahead a few slides to kind of do a bit of a recap on suggested best practices and then open it up for Q&A, and perhaps we come back to our flags overview as time allows.
Yeah, that is completely fine. And hopefully these slides kind of are clear enough so that if we don't have time to go over them, but you're later reviewing them, anyone that's on this webinar, then hopefully they make sense, but always feel free to reach out to us if they don't.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nikki. Yeah, I agree. I think these slides are a very good reference, and we've shared them in prior training. So, you know, we can revisit them here as well if we do have time. But I will just scroll through them, and they do cover a number of those common flags. So they're, you know, quite valuable to review as far as what the data may look like leading to the application of these flags, and then what else you might take a look at in Dart to confirm that the flagging is appropriate. So I'll just step through those quickly. There are a number of good examples there that are available for you. So perhaps, though, Nikki, we can review this slide.
Of course. So yeah, we are kind of close to the webinar, so we want to summarize or present here some items to consider checking when you're reviewing the data in Dart. So items to check is consistency with the field logs. So the data that you're reviewing in Dart, how does it compare to the field sheets? And just note that if anything is likely to be different from those field sheets, say Wood has noticed a likely transcription error, measurements being recorded in the kind of opposite cells to where they should be on the form, then they will note that in the comments along with an A1 flag. Similarly, if UC Davis change any of the data that will likely disagree with what's on your field sheet, we will add the B1 flag. C1 flags are ones where we've done everything we can up to this point before delivering to DART, where there's potentially suspect data, but we're hoping that you can review the data and either make a decision on further actions or can confirm with more information you have on what actually occurred in the field. So those 3 flags are ones to really pay attention to and can help guide some of your review. But please note that these are kind of more of our internal flags, so they do not end up being delivered to AQS. Please review the null and qualifier codes applied to the data. It's important to validate or check at least the valid data as well as the invalid data, because it may have been incorrectly invalidated. Check for any sampling anomalies, extreme high or low values, operational parameter values, with attention to the kind of specific applications of null codes and qualifiers may affect more than you think. And as I mentioned before, sample volume can affect all the species concentrations if it's not correct. Please check field blanks. These are, we use the field blanks from every site across the network per month to calculate MDLs and uncertainties. So if we have several misused field blanks, it can affect the data network wide. So please pay attention to field blanks. If you're starting to see recurring issues, check them out, get in touch with us. Maybe there's something that we can all work on to improving the quality of the data and reducing these issues. Check consistency with other measurements, so cross module kind of comparisons, so sulfur sulfate's a good comparison. There's the functionality in DART to be able to look at neighboring sites to put your site's data into context, as well as historical measurements. Every site is different, so how does your data look for that kind of time period each year? We'd really like it if whenever you write comments, even if it's for your own agency's tracking purposes, if you can write very clear comments, because it really helps us when we review the data before delivering to DART. Does your comment match the actions that we see in the data? And then we will reach out if we do have any questions. Say a parameter got missed from having this qualifier applied, for example, but the notes indicate that all species for that filter type on that date should be flagged in this way, so we can better work out the consistency in the data. The AM null code, which is miscellaneous void, is not very informative, and as an end user, it could mean any multitude of things. So if you have any more specific reasons for why the null code is there, please replace it. There's also plenty of room for qualifiers. And it doesn't mean that the data is bad by having more, it just means that an end user will know kind of the full story about a given record. So there's space for up to 10 qualifiers, and I haven't yet seen 10 applied, but don't hesitate that you don't only have to add one if you want to add more. If there's a series sampling problem, please invalidate the samples, but be careful when applying flags to multiple parameters. And always, please get in touch if you have a question. We're all happy to help at any point in the process. And yeah, the CSN support email address is probably the best place to get in touch with us. And I think this is back to Jennifer again.
Okay, thanks, Nikki. Yeah, so this final slide is just a few tips about using DART for the CSN data review. I won't I'll let you read through these, but I think the main thing that I just wanted to highlight, especially with the new editing options that are available for editing multiple parameters at one time, is to take advantage of the preview. And so if you're wanting to learn, and really see which parameters would be included with a particular set of selections, you can toggle through those selections before you click save and just look at what changes in the preview for which parameters are included. And I think that's a really good way to just familiarize yourself with what the new options include. And then, you know, before you actually make any changes. And with that, I think we wanted to move into a question and answer here. And we really appreciate your time thus far as we walked through these materials. I guess to get started here with Q&A, I know we have a few questions that have been asked in the chat, and we've also received a few questions in advance of the webinar. So maybe Nikki, we'll turn it over to you to cover what was asked ahead of time, and then I'll briefly recap what was asked in the chat. And I think there's a couple outstanding questions there to be answered. And then we will open it up and let everyone unmute as needed to ask any additional questions, either via chat or via the phone. So.
Okay, so we received 2 questions ahead of the webinar, and so we want to take this opportunity to respond here. And I think it's something that many of you might be asking anyway, so hopefully it's helpful. And the first question is, when you see comments in Dart on the data that's from sample handling lab would, noting that there's debris on a filter in a given channel and that the data may be flagged. So the question was, what causes debris in a cartridge or an exposed filter, and how can they possibly eliminate this kind of error in the field? So just some examples of what could lead to debris on filters is that, for example, bugs and other debris could get into the sampler because they were near the cyclone and got sucked in when the sampler was turned on. It could also be that cyclones are possibly getting old and not being replaced often enough. And the way to reduce or eliminate these kind of issues from the field is by following the protocols in terms of regular cleaning and cleaning as needed, especially if it's a fairly polluted site. Then perhaps the regular cleaning would be on a more frequent basis than other sites. The second question we received was in relation to carb analysis, and what does the comment relating to inhomogeneous deposit actually mean? And again, are there any suggestions to improve? So typically this comment means that there's an uneven deposit. So thinking back to those photographs of filters earlier in the webinar, the sample wouldn't look kind of that gray throughout the filter, across the filter. And this is typically observed on the quartz filters. And in these cases, the analysis labs, the carbon analysis lab, would apply an appropriate flag if some part of the filter is visually darker or lighter than other parts, or if the deposit is so thick that it appears flaky. From the data's perspective, one should expect larger data variability among multiple analyses on the same filter that has this inhomogeneous deposit. Reasons for why this may happen in the field is that there could be some slight flow obstruction leading to the uneven deposit, or perhaps the cartridge isn't turning all the way when it's sampling, so there's maybe not a direct hit of the flow on the filter. It's not quite clear how it could be reducing these kind of occurrences in the field. However, if you are frequently seeing these comments and flags on the data at your site, again, please reach out to us, and we'll work with you to see if we can maybe narrow down the reason and help reduce the occurrence of these uneven deposits. Back to you, Jennifer.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nikki. And please do let us know if you have any follow-up questions about that topic. We had a couple of questions in the chat that I'll just highlight. So one of them was when the reconstructed mass and soil were reported to AQS, and I believe Melinda answered that as the June 2019 data. I believe we are at January 2020 now, or going into, and so about half a year or so of those variables have been reported to AQS. And then the second question is, there a way to delete users in the manage user menu? So the new screen in Dart that lists which users are within the agency, and then the configuration options for the CSN validation process. There is not a way from Dart to delete those users. The users that show up there are all of the users with a registered Aeronautech account for that agency. And so the best way, if there are users who are, no longer with the agency at all, would probably be to email the Aeronautech support account. And one quick way to do that is just to use the feedback button that's on any page in Aeronautech, and that brings up a little email dialogue that you can send an email over to our Aeronautech support team and just include in there which user is no longer with the agency, and then we can handle closing out their Aeronautech account if that's the appropriate action that's needed. So that would be handled a little bit apart from our Dart team, but that feedback button is a great way to reach the Aeronautech support team as well. And then another question about when and where the training would be posted. So probably within a few weeks here, we'll post the training and the slides. I think we'll do that from there's several different websites that were listed on the reference other resources slide early in this slide deck. And so I think there's a UC Davis email address or webpage listed there, an EPA one, and also a Aeronautech page. And so probably each of these would have it posted. I think we can also send it out via email with the link to the recording and then also with the slide deck. So we'll probably make that available in a few different ways. But the email itself would probably point you towards each of those. And I think, let's see, I don't know if there were any other chat questions. So with that, maybe we'll open up the floor. And I'll leave everyone muted, so please do unmute yourself to go ahead and ask your question or share any thoughts you have. And you're also welcome to continue to use the chat to ask a question that way. I'll also ask my colleagues here. Melinda, did you see any other chat questions that I did not cover? I think I tried to highlight them.
No, excuse me. I think you've gotten all that I've seen so far.
Okay, great. Thank you. I know we've covered a lot of ground in this training, and we definitely appreciate your time and sticking with us here. And like I said, all of the materials will be made available. And so, if you have any questions as you're digesting it, and or then as you come into Dart and are, encountering any of the new functions, please do reach out to us with questions or feedback at that point as well.
Yeah, so one more question just came in, Jennifer, on the chat, asking if we can go over a little information, I guess, about the OC or EC values above 95th percentile. Nikki, do you have ideas about that one?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'll let Jennifer explain what the 95th percentile actually is in Dart, the time frame that is used to make those percentile values, but just some information on why you may get kind of unusually high OC or EC values. It could be related to local events, particularly for OC. There are many sources of OC particulates, So perhaps there could have been a local fire. In that case, I would recommend looking at potassium values as well, to try and indicate if it's more likely to be a fire as opposed to some other kind of source of OC. But typically, if we see high OC values in the network, we suspect wildfires to be cause of that. EC values being high, it would be unusual for it to be a particularly local event, but some sources of EC could be related to highway traffic, freeway traffic. So if your site is close to, say, a toll plaza or an interchange, then you may see high EC, but perhaps more consistently at those kind of sites. Maybe some higher peaks could be related to if it's stagnant conditions and the wind direction, and time of year in general could lead to slightly higher than usual for that site. But in terms of the percentiles and why it might show up, I'll pass that over to Jennifer to explain those calculations.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Nikki. I'll just add that the way the percentiles are calculated is based on and that's for OCEC, but all of the parameters, is based on the entire data record available in Dart for that data set. So a little while ago, Dart was sort of backfilled, so to speak, or data from AQS were added into Dart so that there's a multi-year data record available in Dart for each site, based on both data from AQS as well as the data that builds up over time as each of the new batches are received from the lab. And so with each new batch, those statistics are recalculated to figure out what the percentile values are. And then in a particular batch, if a value exceeds that 95th percentile, that would be displayed to you. And again, that can help identify any outlier type concentrations that may warrant some additional investigation, and exploring some of the things that Nikki mentioned. And we do also perform, just on that topic, a periodic update of Dart to bring into Dart the data that were ultimately submitted to AQS, so that there is a record in Dart that's consistent with the AQS data record. And thanks for that question. There are a number of statistics that are available in Dart, both in the summary table and then also on the time series. There's a way to add statistics to the time series plot, so you can see what some of those things look like based on the full historical record relative to your current batch concentrations. We didn't have time, there's a lot to cover here, but definitely there's other features like that within Dart that can help with a review as well. Okay, well, thank you again, everyone. I think we're just about at the end of our scheduled time here for this training. So we really appreciate you joining us for this training, the good questions, and we will be in touch to share the slides and the recording with you, and definitely would appreciate any thoughts or questions you have going forward, either with the data once the new data batches resume in Dart, or about any of the new functions or processes that we've covered here. So thanks very much for joining us, and thank you, Nikki, for hosting this with me and Melinda as well. And we will wrap it up and wish you all a good rest of your day.